Righto guys, welcome back to another episode of Digger Reacts. Just a few things before we get started. I have noticed a few things that you've brought up, being my audio, my lighting situation, and probably the green screen. So I'll be working on getting a fix for those coming up. Today we're going to look at Binkov. He's quite a good little puppet historian on YouTube, but I'll put his original link down below. But we're going to be looking at his video on what he thinks would happen if Russia did invade the Ukraine. Quite a hot topic at the moment. Thought it was time that I did one. So yeah, let's get stuck into it. Alright guys, so as usual, we'll have the link for the original video by Binkov down below. Definitely go check him out. Hit like and subscribe if you like my content. Really trying to get my subs up at the moment and the views up. And also there'll be my Discord and other platforms that I'm available on if you want to check them out. Let's get stuck into this video.
As Russia has made it clear, the threat of Ukraine seeing some sort of military action on its territory is not a mere fantasy. But given that the US and the UK explicitly stated they would not send its own troops into the fight, Russia knows it would be fighting basically just Ukrainian military if it invades. If the invasion does happen, it may go several ways.
So I just will stop that there. I know that the UK has sent what they call the NLAWs, similar to a Javelin anti-tank weapon. I think around, can't remember, there was quite a few, and US has done the same with Javelins, and I think they've sent, it's just rumours at the moment, but I think it was around 800 to 2,000. I just assume Special Forces, probably Army Special Forces, to train the locals in how to use such weapons, being it's probably going to be a pretty large scale armour conflict.
This video presents one of the more likely courses of events in the first few days, weeks and months. Attack would be quite swift initially. Ukrainian leadership doesn't seem to be preemptively mobilizing its population, which means all those Ukrainian reservist troops would start to get mobilized only after Russia commences its attack. The war would be...
One thing too, I'm pretty sure, this is really dumb of me, I should have probably checked this, but I'm pretty sure the Donbass region down here is, was recently annexed by Russia. It was sort of the first Ukraine-Russia war, if you put it as that. And there's still pro-Russian militias down here. Having said that, there's quite a shitload of militias ready to fight, and just civilians in general in the Ukraine.
Be destined to become a very bloody affair. Let's get back to our video. Initially, it would be some 150,000 Ukrainian troops against a roughly similar number of Russian ground troops, as the Russians would likely rush in several tens of thousands of additional troops within mere days before the war, over the usual quoted figure of 100,000 that they have now near the borders. But the Russian side is much better equipped with modern heavy armaments, and knows how to use them. For the most part, Ukraine's military hardware is still stuck in the Soviet era. Ukraine's air force is only a token force of maybe 100 airworthy planes, while Russia has 1,000 combat jets. Ukraine's air defenses are almost obsolete. The West did sell some new weapons to Ukraine, and the US did give some weapons for free, but having several hundred Javelin anti-tank missiles is a drop in a bucket of overall needs.
So I'd say that's probably right off the bat, without looking any further into the video. They've got the numbers, they've got what seems to be the infantry soldiers to fight on the line. They don't have anti-air or anti-tank capacity by the sounds of it, or their own sort of tanks or air force, or effective air force anyway, which is a huge huge one-up for Russia. I guess that's why we're providing such missiles such as Javelins and whatnot.
Ukraine would definitely start adding more troops. Its various paramilitary forces and law enforcement forces could add another 100,000 lightly armed fighters in a matter of days. Its reservists would take longer, however. In theory, 900,000 reservists are to make themselves available to the war effort. But not all would actually volunteer to serve. Plus, despite most having army experience, a period of mobilization training would have to be met. Ukraine's own commanders have estimated 30 to 60 days of training might be needed for.
So it'd be similar in any situation, I guess. I mean, similar with the Australian Army. I could go back now as a reservist and have to complete my individual ready AIRN, Australian Individual Readiness Notice, I think. Individual Readiness Notice. So they've got the forces. They haven't been mobilised yet, but yeah, an extra 900,000. That's crazy.
Most. Indeed, Ukraine's commanders are not very optimistic as to how well Ukraine could do in a conflict.
Yeah.
The head of Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service, Budanov, said there aren't enough military resources for repelling a full-scale attack. He added that Ukrainian military would quickly be incapacitated and its leadership unable to coordinate a defense and supply the front.
Sorry, I have to go back and look at that.
Be incapacitated and its leadership unable to coordinate a defense and supply the front. Finally, he finished saying that the frontline commanders would carry on the fight alone for as long as there are bullets. That's not an unrealistic estimate, as the intelligence gathering edge the Russians would have.
Stop it there again. I need to add my 2 cents worth, but I think either it's going to end up being a war which NATO members asked to join in, or it's either going to go the other way and be a very long, bloody war for Russia, with some severe political consequences. Either way is sort of a bit crazy of them, but I did read somewhere trade-wise, I think the 6% they get from the US, they could easily pick up from China, which is probably another video in itself, the China-Russia relations.
Means they would know exactly where to strike, and the air superiority they would enjoy would seriously hamper Ukrainian communication and supply nodes. Indeed, the only thing Ukraine might have over the Russian force is the numbers on the ground. A part of the Ukraine's reservist force actually underwent some training, and roughly 130,000 reservists are thought to be trained well.
It's not just reservists either. I don't know whether it's in the same category as the militias reservists, but I know general civilians themselves have been training. There was a video on Vice, of all places, but yeah, showing that civilians have made their own sort of people's battalion. Outfitted themselves out with their own weapons and webbing and equipment and stuff. So it looks like the country's ready to fight if Russia does try and take.
180,000 people in total in Ukraine have had some war experience since 2014. It's also possible Russia would start calling on its reserves, but only in limited numbers. It's more likely that once Russia decides its active military is not enough to proceed any further, it would stop the entire offensive and be satisfied with what it got. Mass-scale war effort might not be popular with the Russian population and would definitely be a drag on the economy, which would already be heavily hit by sanctions imposed by the West. Without good mobility and with firepower, precision and reconnaissance issues, those numerically superior Ukrainian forces would still be on the defensive. They would protect the long Ukrainian front, but would surely find themselves overwhelmed locally. Russia would use all its hardware edge to isolate pockets of Ukrainian forces and deal with them piecemeal. Weeks into the war, Russia would likely start encountering more and more resistance as the Ukrainian mobilization effort matures. Also, the US would likely share whatever intelligence data it has with Ukraine.
So it would be kind of like a super guerrilla warfare that the Ukraine forces could employ on Russia. This is my little digger or private brain in sort of a huge battle context. But yeah, it seems like that's what it seems like anyway.
Ukraine. The US government already publicly signaled that might happen back in December, and various additional armaments would likely pour into Ukraine from both the EU and the US. Not just anti-tank missiles, but air defense systems, radars, communication devices, night fighting equipment, and so on. Basically anything that doesn't need months of...
That to say, it doesn't require months of training. Night fighting equipment, essential. These anti-armor, anti-air, definitely essential. But it's a war that probably the US and other Western countries don't want to get too bogged down in. So they're probably going to provide, as I said, intelligence and support by weapons and stuff, and maybe advisors and training. But with Taiwan and China, it's sort of, we deploy here, what happens to Taiwan? Scary situation.
Of training to be used. Even so, some NATO country troops are bound to find themselves within Ukraine, not to engage in combat, but to help train a corps of Ukrainian soldiers to use such equipment.
Yeah.
Russian casualties might be in the tens of thousands if they avoid combat in urban areas. That's actually a low number for such a huge offensive, but it's facilitated by the fact that Ukraine is largely flat, without hills or even huge forests, perfectly suited for the Russian hardware edge and its military doctrine of amassed artillery and quick armored pushes. If the war goes on too long, though, Russia would lose the leverage of gas exported to the EU, which means even more of the EU countries might help Ukraine logistically and pile up on Russia economically. At a certain point, perhaps months into the war, Russia might hold quite a chunk of Ukraine, which also means lots of disgruntled people left to pacify. Losing hundreds of soldiers daily to insurgents would not be popular, so the political pressure to end everything would eventually rise.
To be honest, I have no idea the Russian people's idea on what's happening here. If you are from Russia, or if you know anything about that, let me know, because it'd be interesting to see what their ideas and if there's any government pushback in terms of the people. Yeah, what it seems to be is that if Russia does invade, they're probably going to take a fair bit of land, but it's going to be a long bloody conflict with, as I said, that sort of super guerrilla warfare funded by, you know, the Five Eyes intelligence, better weaponry and such.
It's very unlikely Russia would go for the entire Ukraine. Even if it does, it would not be with the forces it has amassed now. Such an offensive would take more than mere months. It would mean so many Russian lives lost and so many planes and tanks lost that reservists would have to be mobilized in droves. It's thus possible Russia would stop by the end of winter. Before that moment, Russia might also try to secure the coastal regions west of Crimea. But that area would be a gamble and might come with greater cost in Russian lives. Fewer pro-Russian people live there, and logistically it would be harder for Russia to take and sustain. On the other hand...
Yeah, so I think I was right. There's a fair amount of pro-Russian people living here in the Donbass region. But I think what Russia wants is this open port. It's pretty clear to take this area, though, without first taking this bit of land would be quite hard.
If Russia does not go for that region, it's likely the unrecognized Transnistria region of Moldova would eventually fall, being surrounded by hostile Ukrainian and not friendly Moldovan forces. But Russia might also take the opportunity, since it's already invading Ukraine and since it's been clearly told by the West that they won't intervene militarily, to also create a larger safety zone in the north and take pretty much everything east of the river Dnieper, which includes reaching Kiev itself, possibly stopping the conquest only close to the city's suburbs. Indeed, in theory, Russia might even make Kiev and other traditional locations of authority in Ukraine a priority. Sure, crossing the river Dnieper and trying to take Kiev would likely result in immense casualties for Russia, but there could be some benefits to it. Russia could, for example, use the invasion to install a new pro-Russian government in Kiev, while leaving Ukraine independent on paper. While such a move would surely not be recognized in the West, in the medium term some of the political and economic fallout for Russia might be somewhat lessened. Still, it would be a move with no guaranteed outcome, and taking Kiev would tie a large part of Russian forces, likely meaning some other parts of Ukraine east of Dnieper might still be under control of the original regime. The disadvantages of such an approach would be needing to control many urban areas with a big population, one that is not as pro-Russian as the east of the country. If Russia does take such territory, it would suffer much heavier casualties.
I understand, not that it really matters this video, but that is a Russian blank firing barrel. Russian blank's dangerous, apparently. I think it is anyway. Someone can back me up, let me know. An AK, yeah.
As well as suffer insurgency from local paramilitaries. A decades-long threat could
Yeah.
potentially develop, not unlike the IRA in Northern Ireland, not just locally in Ukraine, but also a terrorist threat all over Russia, much
Yeah,
bigger than the
I think
Chechen
so too.
terrorist threat was back in the day. The offensive part of the campaign would likely be over by the spring. Ukraine would be in no shape to retake territory it lost on its own. By then, Russia
that
might have
defensive
taken
line.
additional territory the size of Michigan or the United Kingdom, though not with all its population, as it's likely millions would flee westward.
Forget how big Ukraine is in terms of European countries, and just how hard it would be for Russia to actually successfully. It's not like back in World War II where they can just blitzkrieg a country. It's a lot more political side effects than, it would turn into an absolute disaster, in my opinion.
Still, even if as much as half the population flees, Ukraine would lose and Russia would likely gain almost 8 million people. Would Russia suffer economically
fight.
due to the invasion? The EU and the US would impose sanctions for sure. If those end up including everyday goods,
Pause it again, sorry, but just on that, the EU, the US, UK, Australia did say that they would consider sanctions and probably do whatever our bigger brothers and cousins did.
Russia might find itself in a problem, as it exports almost half of its goods to the EU. Exports to the US are fairly small. When it comes to imports, things are not much different, so all that trade being cut off would be a hugely negative event for Russia,
40,
though the EU would
4%.
also be somewhat impacted. The EU imports some 100 billion euros worth of goods from Russia annually, while it exports some 8-ish billion euros worth of goods. The US itself is very little dependent on trade with Russia. Under 1% of US exports and imports are Russia-related. Russia itself is a bit more dependent on the US, but not by much, with imports from the US accounting for some 5% of Russia's total imports. Cutting most trade off would be hard, but in theory doable for most EU countries. Even if not all countries agree, the US could unilaterally influence the international SWIFT payment system, basically doing to Russia what it did to Iran, and preventing most countries from trading with it effectively. But Russia has been establishing an alternative payment system with China. Indeed, much if not all of the items to Russia would find itself without could be replaced by China, not overnight, but in due time.
So that's my biggest concern is Russia, China, sort of combination. Looks like we sort of learned our lesson quite a while ago and stopped relying a lot on Russian goods, but we still rely a fair bit on Chinese goods. And the trade war in Australia is quite bad with China as it is. Something like this happened, it would only sort of exacerbate it. I don't think it would worry Australia too much, other than obviously the world wouldn't be at peace.
Of course, oil and gas could hurt the EU more in the short term. On average, the EU imports a huge amount of crude oil, natural gas and coal from Russia. Two areas would be hit the most: electricity generation and heating. Winter months will make the EU's problems worse for both,
Could be a good
but
thing.
especially for heating.
Global
So
warming.
now the timing of Russian military buildup leading to the start of winter starts to make sense, as well as Putin's insistence that negotiations must not be stalled. It was in Russian interest to pressure the West for negotiations to be blunt and short. So if Russia does attack, it would be when the EU is at its most vulnerable, dependent on Russia for a big chunk of its heating and electricity needs. Then again, Europe has curtailed its purchases of Russian gas in December on its own, as it tries to diversify its suppliers and move away from long-term contracts with Russia. Will the EU be able to sustain itself with little Russian gas really depends on the harshness of this year's winter. If rolling blackouts start and whole neighborhoods are periodically devoid of gas for heating, unity within the EU
Just have to stop it there and say, in Australia, that threat of having no heating doesn't really hit as hard as it would for a country like the Ukraine in the winter. For us, it would be cold. It'd probably get hot in the summer, but we wouldn't it wouldn't necessarily be a death sentence. Scary to think snowing outside, you know, in the minus up to minus 40 degrees, and you've got no heating. Yeah.
Might be put to the ultimate test. Even if the SWIFT payment system is unavailable, it's not unimaginable that certain EU countries would still give an arm and a leg paying through other goods and commodities to Russia, or simply obstruct the EU's unity on sanctions to Russia. Once April comes and energy demands dwindle, Russia's position might be bleaker, which is why if Russia does invade, it probably plans to achieve most of what it wants within a mere month or two. But what about a more distant future? There's a strong possibility that Russia would be faced with exactly the thing it didn't want, with another NATO-aligned country bordering territory it controls. Whatever is left of Ukraine would be fiercely anti-Russian, and most likely populated by NATO forces as well. In practice, that means Russia would lose that.
I do know that quite a few countries around Ukraine are sort of pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia. Like Estonia, for example, I know they're a NATO member now, whether they would send troops. But I can't see smaller countries sending soldiers. If they were going to send any soldiers from anywhere, I'd say it would be, you know, the typical France. They still want to. Australia, New Zealand, UK, America, Germany, all those sort of countries.
Part of Ukraine for good. It would find itself almost totally isolated, perhaps not to the degree of North Korea and Iran, but still unable to properly trade with the EU, which was once its biggest trading partner. China would surely replace that market over time, but such changes aren't done quickly, and they usually mean significant concessions. Just like the ruble lost half its value after 2014, and just like Russia went into a few years-long economic crisis, the same would repeat again, only with even stronger effects. Russia would find itself poorer than it was, and not competitive in high-tech products. It would become a cheap labor force for simple products for the vast Chinese market. That's not to say that China would profit most from the war in Ukraine. Indeed, it's likely China doesn't want Russia to invade Ukraine at all, because if that happens, China would find itself in a hard place politically. On one hand, Russia is one of the few true and powerful allies China has. It doesn't want to endanger that relationship. On the other hand, being silent on the whole war or even publicly support Russia would detach it even further from the Western countries and their important markets. While China itself wouldn't be sanctioned the way Russia would be.
I mean, we're kind of in the same situation with China and Taiwan, aren't we? It sort of feels like one invades, the other's going to. I can see that if China went for Taiwan, Russia would go to Ukraine, and vice versa. That's just my own thinking. It's no real sort of my own educated guess, but there's nothing really backing that up. That's just a feeling that I have. But yeah, hugely political. We're definitely in the middle of another Cold War. Only this time it's more than, one country. It's China and the Russian forces.
If it says the Russian offensive is legitimate, its businesses would still hurt. China would most likely avoid taking sides publicly, but it would still have an economically weaker ally in Russia for the future. EU citizens would not likely freeze in the thousands during the winter, even if fuels for heating are cut off early in the war. Redistribution of fuels for heating would happen instead. Electricity too would be redirected to heating. Hugely expensive emergency purchases of fuel would happen, delivered by ships, which would partially help out. The EU economy and government budgets would take a huge temporary hit, but they would survive. And those few countries that did previously want to trade with Russia would most likely not want to have anything to do with it for some time to come. The US would largely be unfazed by the entire affair. Its government would spend some money on weapons sent to Ukraine, but it would not likely be tens of billions. Its eyes would not be on Russia, but on China, which is the reason why it did not maintain the veil of uncertainty about sending its troops to Ukraine.
I mean, that makes sense. That's the reason why we have AUKUS, submarine deal, all the new weapons, the tanks we're getting, all that sort of stuff. sort of looks like short game is Russia-Ukraine, long game seems to be China-Taiwan, and China's global sort of outreach in general.
If the US threatened to send its forces to Ukraine, but Russia still invaded, then the US would lose face and show itself as an unreliable ally if it ultimately did not send troops. The political damage would be worse than in reality, where the US said it wouldn't send troops right from the start. To get bogged down in any kind of war in Ukraine at this moment is something the US does not want. It doesn't want its military might even partially tied up when its eyes are set on containing China. Much of US war efficiency comes from air power, helping the ground forces, and US fears that the majority of that might be needed against China, perhaps even on a short notice.
That's our
To
biggest
pull them out
advantage.
of Ukraine would possibly mean leaving US-owned ground troops without firepower. The whole world would definitely change if Russia attacked Ukraine.
That's why I'd say it's probably, there were troops sent there from America. I can't remember if there was any sort of, they mentioned who they were, but I dare say they'd probably be Army Special Forces. That's sort of their role. Get in there, get amongst the community and train them to what they need. But as far as all out offensives or defensives, I can't imagine America going just because of China, and same as the UK. We just can't afford to get bogged down there.
The big geopolitical rift between East and the West would grow even bigger overnight. Very
As
hard
it stands,
borders,
right?
populated with many troops, would spring up between Europe and Russia. The Cold War would be once again in full swing.
Alrighty. So what do we think of all that? There's a lot to unpack. I probably didn't do the best of unpacking. It's just, as I always say with my videos, it's my thought as an Australian digger, Australian private in the army for 6 years. Scary times. I feel like something big's coming. I don't know what it is. That could be just my own sort of anxiety, I guess, to the situation. But with China and Taiwan situation, the trade war happening with us and China, Russia invading Ukraine will just make things worse. Of course, with the pandemic as well. So, what do you guys think? What do you think will happen? Do you think do you think Russia will take Ukraine? Do you think China will take Taiwan? Put it down in the comments. As I said, if you want to have a further discussion, share pictures and stuff, check out my Discord. There's also a Facebook link there and my Twitch channel where I stream sort of tactical first-person shooters. Thanks, guys, and speak to you soon.